Hello, everybody. I was excited to see how much interest there was in doing a retrospective analysis of the storm we just had February 13th, 2024. One of the hardest forecasts in my career, definitely one of the most memorable. So we'll jump right into it. Hopefully, I can get this done on the first take. Decided to do a video instead of a long written out post. So that way we can share more graphics and hopefully get better visuals. Let's jump right into it. So these were the totals that we saw from the storm. A full 12 to 16 inches here in Greater Danbury in many spots. The I-84 corridor just got crushed with this as we ended up in the deformation band, and really kind of the peak of the storm. So what were the players in play? These are the main ingredients that we were talking about. Um, the northern stream is the northern vorticity, the northern wave. All those things mean the same thing. Basically, the piece of energy that's from the north. B, the piece of energy from the south. In our biggest storms, generally these do what we call phase. They come together. It became clear several days ago that this would not happen in this event, and that complicates things a little bit. It's harder for the models to track and understand the idiosyncrasies of these two interacting, but not phasing, not combining. If you think of it like children, it's hard enough to track one child. Now we have two children that are coming up the East Coast that we need to account for to know their whereabouts at all times. And it was going to be difficult for the models to do that. Basically, A ended up pushing B farther south and east. We'll get into all of that in just a second. But early forecast complications. Not a big fan of complaining about snowstorms. Every snowstorm's complicated forecast, but this one had particular challenges. So, likelihood of a narrow band of heavy snow, which is what we got. I didn't realize we were going to be in the absolute middle of it, but that's what we got. Mid-level energy interacting but not phasing. We mentioned that a second ago. That's that 500 millibar map. Marginal air mass, temperatures 30 to 34 degrees. That was definitely a complication, and the ground not being frozen, which I would think would ultimately limit the sticking. Ended up we had snowfall rates 2 to 3 inches per hour. Did not care about the marginal temperatures nor the ground being frozen, and it accumulated like gangbusters. So back to A and B, right? 500 millibars, the map on the left, is what I would say all good meteorologists use to track snowstorms. This is where minor variations to this energy will create big variations at the surface. So the surface map to your right is what we conventionally share on social media. It's easier for people to kind of understand and digest. But to the left, the 500 millibar vorticity is what drives the storm. This is the mid-level energy that basically creates and maintains the storm as it moves along. So what we were seeing originally, we were seeing A, over the Great Lakes, and B, taking a favorable track to the south of New England for what I would consider being an interior snowstorm. This is where we were a little bit worried about mixing issues near the shoreline. This is where we thought that the maximum amount of snow, the jackpot, was going to be centered somewhere from Albany to Boston. Those areas ended up receiving zero snow. So this is 72 hours before the storm, where this was kind of the game plan. We started to see winter storm watches populate throughout interior Connecticut and then all of Massachusetts and a lot of upstate New York. Now, big changes here. So from 72 hours before the storm to 48 hours before the storm, look what happens with A. A moves about 200 miles southeast. A is almost in Michigan. It's in central Michigan to central Pennsylvania. A huge jump on A. What's that do? That shunts B out to the south and east. And it also changes its orientation. Early on, B was what we call negatively tilted. That's a really good sign for a strong precipitation shield, a strong storm, heavy precip. A little bit less negatively tilted here, a little more progressive, meaning a faster moving storm and kind of a wedged or a narrowed precipitation shield. You can see that here with the precipitation map. You start to see that northwest quadrant get eaten away a little bit. Now, as we go 24 hours before the storm, this is where you see the huge changes. Now, the position A hasn't moved much, but now B, probably from being pushed on continuously by A, again, small changes can make a big deal at the surface. Now, B is almost neutral and in a position to not kick back as much snow, especially the northwest flank. So this is when we started panicking a little bit in the forecast department. We were talking about the de-amplification trend. B looked stretched out. So just 24 hours ago, we'd seen the southern shift, but I thought Connecticut was in a good spot. Now, just a day before the storm, all of a sudden, it looks like the heaviest might be to the south and east of our area. And then about 12 hours before the storm, so the Monday afternoon, we started seeing a major, major trend shunting the precipitation to the south. And my analysis of that, my understanding was that B is probably weakening to the point where this isn't going to be much of a snowstorm for us in Connecticut. I honestly thought that I-84 points north and west might see a zero out of this storm. Now it ended up, what happened was this trended back northwest at the last second. And we could talk about theory on why that happened, but the models were, I believe, overreacting to this trend about 12 hours before the storm, but it sent up huge red flags, and almost every piece of guidance was doing this. And at that point, you can't ignore it. I had to come on. I felt like I had to communicate, hey, we've had a major, major change to the forecast, shifting it south and east. The dynamics kind of back up the shift south and east, at least on the surface. But again, it ended up being such a close call, and this is what really happened. So the models readjusted. Now, again, I think it's because they couldn't handle that A and B, uh, this A and B interaction very well because it's so complex. They ended up shifting back a little bit to the northwest, and what we ended up being under on the I-84 corridor was really, really good dynamics at 700 millibars and 850 millibars that would scream deformation band. So this was a jump back to the northwest by about 30 or 40 miles. The previous models had had snow mainly in New York City, Long Island, Rhode Island, Cape Cod. Now this had jumped back, and you could almost see it's trying to put a deformation band right where it ended up being through the I-84 corridor here. And the model definitely backed this up. Unfortunately, this came out at 3 a.m. the day of the storm. So I didn't have a lot of lead time on this. I'll be honest, I was that was my window of sleep. So by the time I woke up at 5 a.m., saw this, and then saw the radar, I knew I had to then reforecast more snow from just calling it a bust hours before, because the whole trend the last 3 days had been de-amplified. It had been to make the storm weaker, shunt it south and east. Now, the last second model readjustment, again, wasn't handling that energy collision very well. Um, and this is what we ended up with. So, in the end, narrow band, heavy snow, right on I-84, the marginal air mass being overcome by the tremendous snow rates, again, from that band, the deformation band that ended up just to the northwest of the main forcing. That's very typical for winter storms. Again, if I'd seen this 24 hours earlier, I probably would have been more optimistic in big totals. But look at how narrow this ended up being. Almost no snow in extreme, extreme northwestern Connecticut to 12 to 16 inches, only 40 miles south and east along the I-84 corridor. So really, really tough in the end. Um, we had good dendritic growth, which led to good flake size. Again, that's all dynamic driven. Big, moist, dynamic lift in the snow growth layer gave us that big flake size, 2 to 3 inches per hour for several hours, and just a challenging forecast overall. Right, we had to take into account all these different variables. Um, if you asked me again in a similar setup, I I think it's unlikely that we hit the jackpot in this, but it ended up being that most of Connecticut was in essentially the perfect spot for this storm. So, all in all, definitely a learning experience. Definitely something that I'm going to look back on as a communication lesson. I do regret calling this a bust. Maybe I should have just been more transparent with the forecast challenges. And I mean, it's so tough at the end of the day to second guess yourself. You can always Monday morning quarterback, but um, I never thought that there'd be a situation where this would happen, where there'd be a foot of snow and I just wouldn't see it 12 hours before the storm. I thought we were past that in technology. I thought we were past that in forecasting power, but that's essentially exactly what happened. So at the end of the day, forecast loss, all we can do is, I woke up at 5, I reversed myself again. That's kind of my style as a forecaster. I try not to stay stubborn. I try to keep up with the changing times. In this case, it bit me a little bit because I was probably too quick to react and adjust up and down. But again, tough storm, super narrow band. I think this is a Tomerberg map. Shout out Tomer, made this using the NWS data, but you can see just how narrow this was and just how perfectly located a lot of Western Connecticut is. So that's all I got for you. I hope this was somewhat educational. If you guys like this, I will do more of these type of videos in the future to break down these storms. But memorable storm overall, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got all the snow that you wanted, snow lovers. I'm meteorologist Jack Drake. Have a great afternoon.